Welcome to the Better Student Ministry podcast, where we take a deep dive into practical youth ministry topics to help you and your team become better at what God has called you to do. We're joined now by your hosts, Mark and Jared, who together have over 30 years of youth ministry experience.
Hey everybody, welcome to Better Student Ministry podcast. My name is Jared.
My name is Mark.
Glad to be with you. Back on another podcast. We just finished wrapping up the recording of our training video on the topic we're going to talk about today, and might I say, Mark, it was done quite well.
It was good.
Yeah.
There's the cool thing. I'm actually super excited about this podcast too, because we try to keep our video to 10 to 15 minutes, but there was so much,
a lot of content.
Yeah, so much more we wanted to say, and we get to do that here. So
yeah.
I'm super excited to flesh out
dive.
some things. Yeah,
absolutely. So if you haven't gotten to check out our videos, we also, along with this podcast, do 10 to 15 minute training videos for you and your team to wrestle through. We include discussion questions on there, and then this podcast, a little bit of a deep dive for us to wrestle through, hit some more content, some of the stuff you won't hear in the video. So today we're going to do that,
Yep.
And we want to talk about. Mark, introduce what are we hitting on today?
So we're going to be talking about helping students in crisis, and again, I think to start this off, it's important to identify, okay, what are we talking about when we're talking about crisis, right? Because in the lives of teenagers, at least in my experience, not with my own teenagers, though I have one that is 12 and it's going to be a teen this coming February, which my life now is in crisis because of. It can seem like sometimes teenagers, to them, their life is constantly in crisis, right? But what we're talking about specifically here as it relates to crisis is we're talking about deep levels of hopelessness, deep levels of helplessness, where they feel like there's no answer out there. I can't get out of my situation. It's gone too far. I don't know what to do. I feel helpless. I feel hopeless, and I don't see it ever getting any better.
Yeah.
Right. So
we're not talking about the situation where a teenager calls you and is like crying and upset, and then come to find out it's someone stopped following them on Instagram.
Right. Yeah.
In their mind, there is a perceived crisis happening, but that's not the type of crisis we're talking about.
Sure.
We're talking about.
You still have a role in that,
yes.
Right? Like there's still a role that you play in helping them process that in a healthy, spiritual way.
Can you tell that I've lost patience for those situations in years of youth ministry?
Yes. Yeah.
Well, those are a type of crisis, but not
Right.
the ones that we're talking about. We're going to talk about a little more serious type of crisis, and we've got a few thoughts. The first of which that we want to share with you is the idea of identifying the crisis.
Yeah.
Identifying the crisis. So what does this mean?
So in the medical field, there is a very important role. It's the first person you talk to usually outside of when you check into a medical facility, and that's the triage nurse. It's actually a super important role in the battlefield as well, which I think youth ministry sometimes feels like a war zone, a battlefield.
True.
And they have triage medics whose sole job is to go and assess the situation, find out the severity of the situation. Because the sad reality is, on the battlefield, sometimes there's people that you can save, and sometimes there's not, and there's resources that are limited. Same exact thing is true in youth ministry. Some students just aren't. No, I'm just kidding.
Thankfully, we're not the ones saving them.
Exactly. So the first role I think that the youth leader plays in the crisis situation of a student is that of triage nurse. So we need to go and collect as much information as possible so that we can then help implement an action plan, be a part of an action plan. And I think it's really important to start by realizing you aren't necessarily the professional that will bring the final resolve, or you may have to hand it off, I guess is a better way of saying it. You may have to hand this off to other people to help them through their situation, depending on the severity, depending on the specific nuances of it. But as a healthy adult leader, we do have a role of that initial triage. And it's usually because we're the person who may find out first about it. It may be that they feel comfortable sharing their crisis situation with you. Maybe you've paced with a student long enough that you know, hey, there's something going wrong here. So your observation of their life, your time invested in their life is important. One of the books, actually, a lot of this information that we'll be talking about today comes from a book that's called. Let me pull up the title of it here real quick. It's called "The Youth Worker's Guide to Helping Teenagers in Crisis." It's about as clear a title, I guess, as you can get. This is a book by Rich Van Pelt and Jim. My eyes are so bad I can't read his last name. Jim Hancock. And so a lot of the ideas I have today come from this book. This is a super, super helpful book. It was in my youth ministry. In fact, it's one that I grabbed a hold of pretty early on in my youth ministry, and I used it almost as a reference manual on a regular basis, and I did a lot of training of our staff from this book, so totally worth checking out. And so one of the things that says in there, and this is based on some research that they did, is parents will often have a hunch that there's something significant going on, whether it's drug abuse, whether it's alcohol abuse, whether it's unhealthy self-coping mechanism stuff. Usually it takes about 2 years of them kind of having a hunch before any action, or before they confront it or any action takes place, which is a pretty significant amount of time for a student to be in crisis. And so by the time that information is handed off to us, usually it's a pretty deep situation that we're kind of encountering.
Right.
But we're not talking about hunches here. We, as the triage nurses, our job is to get the facts, to get the information.
Yeah. Because there's a big difference. Like, I know in my time in youth ministry, I remember having like many conversations that were kind of like a youth called me up, or a teenager would call me up or talk to me, and they're like in full on panic mode, where it would seem like this is the worst. It's something like, I can't live at home anymore, and of course in your mind I'm going to the worst case, like, okay, what's happening? And as you start to gather information, as you start to triage that situation, you realize like there's a big difference between I can't live at home anymore because it's actually dangerous, and I can't live at home anymore because my parents are overbearing and don't let me do, which
I literally got a call from a student who said those exact words to me, and when I found out, it was because they wouldn't let them go to a party that weren't going to have any adults at it.
Right. And you're right, but in their minds, so that I had many of those conversations over the years. So this is a hugely important part of the role of a youth leader, which is assessing the situation, assessing the crisis, because how you respond is going to really be determined by what type of crisis is happening.
Yeah.
And oftentimes the perceived crisis is not actually as severe. So your job of gathering information is really important and asking a lot of questions. What are some of the type of questions that should be asked?
Yeah. So the type of the things that you're mining for are often have a lot to do with the emotions and the feelings of stuff and the motivations of things. Because I find that it's easy to get the symptoms, right? It's easy to identify the things you can see, the things you can hear. But if you're trying to figure out, okay, what is the source of the crisis? What is the action plan to get us out of it? Motivations, feelings are key. So here's some questions. Again, some of these are from the book as well, but here's some questions that kind of will get the ball rolling, some prompts, if you will, for getting the full story. So things like give them an opportunity to talk to you first, right? You don't have to make any presuppositions or don't jump to conclusions too quickly. Have them share with you as much information as possible. So tell me where the story begins. Who else is involved? Get a picture of all the people that are involved in the story, in the situation. How are they involved? How have you managed to cope up until now? So like usually the teenagers will try to deal with the situation. When it becomes crisis is when they get to the place where like I can't do anything anymore. I can't change the situation. So getting an understanding of, okay, what did you do? What were you trying to do to get you from this situation can help you get a full picture. Because a lot of times the coping strategies that they chose to do can sometimes drive the situation even more severely. So, lies that may have been involved in the situation make the situation so much more complex. Self-medicating, whether it be with drugs or alcohol, sex-related things, can complicate the problem and create different steps that need to take place in whatever the action plan is. here's a great question. If you were your friends, would you be worried about you in this situation? Like, get them to start to think of their from an outside perspective. What advice would you give yourself if one of your friends had this situation? And it might not be the answers you're looking for, but it helps you understand more what they're thinking and how they're processing the situation. Getting information if they do have any care from a doctor or from a counselor, knowing that information is helpful when you're creating an action plan. Okay, they have been seeing someone, they've been talking to someone. What was it helpful? When was your last visit? Tell me a little bit more about that. Is there any medication that was prescribed? Are you doing any self-medicating? Things like that. You're building trust. You're hearing their story. You're listening to them. And for me, you've got to focus on the listening piece. My personality is such to give the answer, to find a solution, to find the exit ramp. Oh, this is obvious. I know how to find your way out of here. But often in crisis, there may be a logical action plan, but for the student that's in it, logic is not going to apply at this point, and so they need to know that you're hearing them, that there's some trust that's involved, and that's a I got to be emotionally invested process.
Yeah, I think that's really good, and that's probably true of relationships in general, but especially when teens are walking through crisis. And one of the things I would add to that is I would say, like, majority of the quote crises that you're going to encounter with students are not going to be extreme severe like what we're talking about. However, your ability to be the person of which they would share those extreme crises when they're going through, a lot of time depends on you doing what you're talking about in the minor crises, right? Yeah. It's that being present, it's that listening, it's that trusting, that not dismissive or quick to solve the problem without hearing their heart. Because sometimes in those minor things, it's just giving them a space to communicate what they're feeling, and then it's like, okay, now it doesn't feel like a crisis to me. But if we're not willing to put in that work, then when they go through big stuff, we may not be the person that they share that with, and we want to be that person because we know we're going to help them find the right solution and the right help.
Yeah, and I think it's also important too, as we're empathizing, as we're sympathizing, it's important to, one, for us to understand spiritually where we stand in relationship to the cross, where we stand in relationship to who God is and what His ability is. I've known certainly a lot of teenagers and certainly a lot of young adults, a lot of youth leaders, where they will carry the weight of the crisis of a situation. And it can have some serious effect, not only in your ability to help them through an action plan, if you take on the offense, if you carry the weight, because I've heard some horrible stories and situations from students where I'm ready. I click into dad mode really easily when it comes to some of our students, and I'll be like, I'll go find your parents right now and I'll just go punch them in the face. That'll solve this problem, right? Like, and I can almost begin to ramp up the situation more as I allow my own emotion to take over. So it's important to be able to hand that to absorb it, but then be able to hand it off to God as well and say, hey, you got to give me wisdom here. Yeah. You've got to give me direction here. I tell this to our compassionate, super feeling youth leaders all the time, which I'm not one necessarily. Absorb that stuff, bring it in, but then you got to be ready to hand it off pretty quickly to God and be like, hey, you got to give me strength here. You got to give me direction here, or we can become clouded pretty quickly.
Yeah, that's really wise. That's one of the thoughts I was having too, is keep a clear, calm mind until you get the full story.
Yeah.
Because oftentimes, and this happens everywhere, people get a picture of the story and immediately jump to conclusions or assumptions without all the facts and data. And because you love these students, and because you want the best for them, it's very easy to take on their perceived slights as your slights without getting the full picture. And sometimes when we don't do that, we can burn bridges. We can make parents feel like maybe we don't trust them, and then all of a sudden we hear like, well, actually this is what happened. And then we're like, oh man, I'm so sorry. So keep a calm head, a cool mind before you get, until you get all of the facts from all of the different parties involved, then you can make a clear picture and move forward.
And there's ways to do that, to not make the student feel like you don't believe them or trust them, or to make the parent feel like you don't believe or trust them. And quite honestly, again, and we say this all the time, it comes back to comes back to consistency. It comes back to longevity. Hey, we've paced together for a long time. Like, trust me, trust the process. Trust me in this process. We can help to minimize the situation for the sake of calm and clarity, without placating or making it seem like what you're feeling is not as severe as you're making it seem, and it's not as big a deal. As soon as you start trying to convince them out of it being a big deal, you're going to lose their trust pretty quickly. Right. So there are ways that we can minimize and we can control contamination control but still be compassionate, empathetic, loving, and caring, and they don't think this is a big deal, but this is a big deal.
Right. That's good.
Yeah.
The second thought that we talked about a little bit in our training video, and you can check that out as well, is the idea of not only assessing the crisis, but what's our role in the crisis? Yeah. And I know you've talked a little bit about that. So how do we, as a youth leader or youth pastor, a crisis comes up, how do we define and figure out our role in the midst of this crisis?
Yeah, I think one of the things that will be really important for us to talk about here too, in understanding our role is to be aware that I mentioned this at the beginning, but you're not necessarily a medical professional. Now you may be a youth leader who's a counselor, a psychologist, a medical doctor of some sort, and that's great. And if you have those skills and you have those abilities to share those with your team, you're going to be a huge asset. But more often than not, you're just a loving, caring adult leader who wants to see students encounter Christ and have their life transformed and healed, which is a super important role in crisis, because the reality is, in most of these situations, if it's not God doing the transforming of the heart, yes, we can remove situations, and we'll talk about that in our action plan. We can do practical things to change, but God has got to heal their heart. He's got to change motivations. He's got to be the heavy lifter, so to speak, in these crisis situations, especially when hopelessness and helplessness are a significant
role. And this ties really together with our first point, right? Because your role in the crisis will be dependent on really what type of crisis it is.
Yeah.
The more severe a crisis gets,
yeah,
your role is going to be in a lot of ways handing things off.
Yeah.
And the reason why that matters is because you and I have talked a lot about this idea of confidentiality.
Yeah.
And so understanding your role will prevent you from making a major youth ministry mistake, which happens oftentimes with youth leaders, which is a student will say something to you like, I got to tell you something, but you can't tell anybody.
Yeah.
Right? And how you respond to that. So what was some of your advice that you would give to your youth leaders when inevitably you would hear this in youth ministry?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that I always made very clear with our youth leaders were we don't blanketly promise confidentiality. I did have a lot of trust with my leaders. I prayed that they would constantly use wisdom, but I think there's something really unhealthy about having this kind of blanket policy of confidentiality. First of all, we don't have a patient-client confidentiality agreement as youth leaders. So we are not. We don't. They're not. We're not obligated to keep anything confidential.
It's actually the opposite,
exactly.
Right? In certain situations, we're legally obligated to report certain things. We're considered mandatory reporters on some situations.
Yeah. So I would tell my staff, and I would explain to a student, I would say, listen, I am so thankful that you would trust me to want to share this information with me, that you would think so much of our relationship that you would be willing to share some pretty personal, pretty painful information with me. Would you also then be willing to trust me to take that information and use it in the most appropriate way? And if we decide together there's some people that we need to talk to about it, we'll talk through that together. I'm not going to surprise you with anything. I'm not going to expose anything without you knowing fully what the plan is going to be, and we'll do it together. So you don't have to feel like you're alone, unless you choose, hey, this is something. But if you trust me enough to share this information with me, trust me enough to know we'll use this information to bring the most health to you. And I never had a student student who said, no, I don't want to tell you anymore. Because chances are, if they're coming to you, they've got friends they can vent to. There's so many places they can just put information out if they're not looking for help. But most students at that point, if they're coming to you with something, they're looking for some sort of help. And usually what that means is, please don't tell mom and dad I'm going to get in so much trouble, but I need help and I don't know how to get out of this. But you have to remember, as a youth leader, your first responsibility is to God. Quite honestly, your second responsibility is to the parents of those students. You're not their mom and dad. You may be the healthiest adult leader in their life, but ultimately our job is to come alongside families, pace with them, help parents process situations, get through situations. And a lot of times we play mediator between parent and child to help them communicate clearly, to help them express what's going on.
Yeah, I love that. One of the things that we used to do or talk about with our leaders when they're trying to determine what's my role, and a lot of times for a youth leader, they hear something that a student would say to them, and they may ask the questions like, oh, should I say something? Should I tell somebody about this or should I not? It's not always so black and white, right? Yeah. So our rule of thumb that I would say to them is, listen, guys, at the end of the day, I'm the youth pastor, which means I bear the most responsibility and I'm accountable at the end of the day. So if you're not sure on whether or not you should share something, err on the side of sharing it with me. And I may say to you, hey, it's no problem. We don't need to, that's not something that we need to talk to their parents about, or that's not something we need to take any further. That's good between you and them. But they knew I was safe to talk to. And I would always say, err on the side of telling me, because then I can have your back if something were to come out. What we don't want to have happen is there's a really severe situation or something come out, a parent finds out they told this youth leader and the youth leader sat on the information and did nothing with it. Yeah. And then that becomes a really big problem. And ultimately we want to protect the students
Absolutely.
From whatever situation that they're in. So err on the side of letting me know, telling me, and then we would make that decision together.
Yeah, a lot of times that situation would arise as it relates to students who are feeling suicidal, and so in helping to identify the severity of that sort of depression, there's an acronym that I have used, or not, I didn't coin this. There's an acronym that I use that helps identify the severity. I don't want to sound callous. I've been in youth ministry for 16 years, and I've been around humanity for 40 years, and so I know that there are varying levels of severity as it relates to suicide or someone wanting to take their life. Now, all of them are serious, but some of them have higher risk of actually being executed as far as a plan goes. And so it's important for us as we're pacing with teenagers to be able to identify the severity of a situation. Is it just something that they're saying because they're trying to, and again, not that we're not taking this seriously, but are they just saying this because they need attention, they need someone to care for them, or do they actually have a plan to take their life? Because both are bad, but one is, I got to take care of this right now. I can't even let you go home.
There's a difference between saying, sometimes I just want to die.
Yeah.
More of a figurative. Again, it's an indication that there's some stuff happening there.
Yeah.
But there's a difference between that or, like you said in the video, sir, I've got train tracks that run by my house. The train comes every day at 2. I think one of these days I'm going to head out there and just that's a different situation.
Yeah. So this is the acronym that we use is SLAP. Not that we, I don't know who we is. The acronym that I'm using for today in this talk is the acronym SLAP, and this is what the 4 letters represent. So the S represents specific details. So the more specific the plan is, and a lot of people I think they get a little. I've heard adults say, I don't really want to talk with a student through their plan because I don't want them to be formulating a plan as they're talking through it. They either do or they don't have a plan. They either have ideas or they don't. Like, you getting this information from them is not going to all of a sudden help them realize, oh, maybe here's my plan now. I can figure this out. It's more important to assess, okay, what's the level of risk here? So the more specific the details are to the plan, then obviously the more risk that there is that it could be executed. The L stands for the lethality of the method. So there's lots of different ways you can kill yourself. Obviously, you all know the different ways.
Or just as they're envisioning or they're contemplating suicide, sometimes it could be the idea of taking their life, but they're not as serious. So maybe their method would be,
Sure.
I'm going to swallow a handful of Advil, which
Yeah.
wouldn't kill you necessarily, but nevertheless serious, but
Sure.
not the same as I've got a gun at my house and I'm
Yeah.
going to take it.
And there's not to generalize the nuances of the situation as well, but there's kind of two big buckets that a lot of this falls into as well. Sometimes the outcry, the desperation and outcry of I'm going to take my life is I want the people in my life to feel the pain that I'm feeling. So
Right.
a lot of times is I want them to see how much I'm hurting. I want them to understand how much I'm hurting. And it may not. This is going to be fully lethal and take my life, but I want these people to experience. I want them to find me overdosing. I want them to see me bleeding out.
Right.
And then sometimes it's I just want to end it.
Yep.
I want it to be done. And so there's different varying levels of lethality based on that too. So we need to get that information, understand what is the lethality of the method. The A stands for availability or access to the method. So if they're going to drive off a cliff, they need access to a car. How accessible are they to
Right.
getting a car? If they're going to shoot themselves, they need access to a gun. Do they have a gun? Do they know where there's a gun? Do they know a friend that has a gun? Like their access to their means. Like if they're going to swallow a whole bottle of Percocet, do they know where they can get it? Do
Right.
they, if I'm going to OD on some sort of drugs, what's their access level to those
So
drugs?
the idea is if they're talking to you about their plan, and if they leave that meeting, they go home and they have direct access to whatever that thing is, that's more serious than if they don't. And that plays into your determination on how you handle that.
Absolutely. And then the P is proximity to helping resources. So what is their proximity to healthy help?
Right.
Do they have people in their life that can help them? What's their home situation like?
Right.
Now, obviously, they're talking to you, so that's one point of healthy access. But do they have friends in their life that are, sadly, so many times I've had conversations with students, and their friends are in agreement sometimes, and they think they're helping. They think they're empathizing.
Right.
They're either helping them with the process. Hey, I'll help you get this.
Yep.
I'll help you find it. I'll take you there. And they think they're being a friend and helping. Obviously, we know, my goodness, the tragedy of you feeling like and so what kind of people are speaking into their life is a big deal. Like suicide pacts amongst teenagers are real things. It's desperately sad and super wicked as it relates to how the enemy transforms our hearts and makes us feel so hopeless and there's no way out. And so the proximity to help and what kind of people
Right.
are speaking into their life is the last. So it's specific details, lethality of the method, availability or access to the method, and the proximity of helping
And the proximity to
resources.
help will depend sometimes on what you do. Like we had situations, I know, with students who had little to no proximity to help. And so what we had to do is say, okay, you're going to stay with us tonight because we were their only help in that moment. And then there's other students who I knew had loving, Christian, committed parents. And so I could hand them off to that because they were going to be just as if more because they were their parents' supportive proximity to great help. So you've got to know that before you make a decision on how to proceed. So.
Okay. Does involve a lot of practical things like, okay, you may need to be removed from this situation, or these pieces need to be taken out, or you need medical intervention, and all of those things are legitimate. To go on a quick little side tangent, unfortunately in the Christian world, and it's related to this idea, but in the Christian world, the idea of needing medical intervention as it relates to psychological issues, I know it's a hot topic thing, and I would say do as much reading and as much research into it as you can. And I know different people feel different ways about medication, but I'm a firm believer that God has created some brilliant people on the earth who have some really good thoughts and ideas about how to do things and the type of help that students and not just students but humanity can find through whether it be counseling or whether it be through medication. So I'll put it out there. My personal opinion is I think there's a lot of help that can be done by paraprofessionals that aren't spiritual specific solutions that can be helpful, but I would never separate them and just pursue those outside of spiritual health and healing that needs to take place as well. I don't believe that the two are mutually exclusive from one another. I think that both are helpful and needed. And I've seen so much success with students who have pursued medical help as well as we've continued to pace with them on spiritual help.
Yeah, I think that's great, Mark. And one thought I would have this is what we would say to our team, because we had a couple of leaders, maybe really just one I remember in my time, who had some pretty strong beliefs, anti kind of medication stuff that I did not share. And I said to her, listen, that's your personal conviction and that's fine. But when we're dealing with teenagers, you're not allowed to insert your personal convictions into their lives as you're giving advice or recommending situations. Because ultimately that's the responsibility of their parents and their family. You're responsible for your kids and your family, but when we're discipling teenagers in this church and this ministry, we're going to help put them in the hands of help, and then they make those decisions on things like should there be medication or what. Like that's not our role, right?
Yeah.
That's the part of assessing our role. That's not our role. So,
and that's where I think when I was speaking earlier about sometimes we're a mediator between the teenager and their parents, even sometimes too. It's important to understand your role, your responsibility. And then to some degree, sadly, I wish this wasn't true, but a lot of times the interactions that I have had with parents involves them downplaying the situation, and it's not as big of a deal as you think it is, and it's not as severe as you think it is, and I don't think they need to go see counseling, and I don't have the money for counseling, or I don't have the money for medication.
Right.
And so they begin to try to defend and justify what's going on, and they're emotional all the time, and our job sometimes is to help them see what's going on.
It's to be an advocate, right?
Yeah, and to say, listen, yes, as a healthy adult, this may not be a big deal to you, but for them it is. And quite honestly, maybe the bigger deal and the reason why they feel helpless and hopeless is they don't think they have a parent who is empathizing with their situation. And so they're like, who the heck else am I supposed to trust? And if dad isn't going to defend me in this situation, or if mom's not going to come alongside me in this situation, then am I really on my own out here?
Yeah.
And so being healthy, being emotionally wise, and to some degree helping to frame the situation and see it from a different perspective and say, hey, mom and dad, maybe think of this, maybe consider this. Those are all going to be really, really important roles that you play as a healthy spiritual adult leader in their life.
Quick side note, and I know you're going to transition us. This is one thing we did, have a counselor, a professional counselor, not a church staff member, but a professional therapist or counselor that works with young people, have their number and information on hand at all times that you trust and that you know. We had one that we used that we sent a lot of our students to, and not every parent took it up, but you want to have that information. You want to have that relationship that when these situation comes up, you can say, hey, I've got somebody I can recommend to you guys.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really good. So the last part we want to talk about here in this podcast has to do with an action plan. And we'll actually, this action plan is some questions and things to think through as it relates to, okay, how do we help now walk with them through this crisis? I've triaged the situation. I understand the crisis as much as I can. Now what do I do with this information? How does it get handed off? And we'll have these steps also as a part of our PDF that we put together with our Better Student Ministry video as well. So you can find this. You don't have to feel like you got to furiously write down these steps right now.
Yeah, it'll be on YouTube and on our Facebook.
We'll have them for you. So the first part of the action plan is, what is the identified problem, but beyond the presenting problem? So again, sometimes the symptoms are what we see. There's smoke before there's fire, that sort of thing. So we see the symptoms, but we hopefully have gotten down to what is the root of the problem. The second step are, what are the possible outcomes, both positive and negative outcomes. So if this situation continues on to its logical extreme, what are the outcomes that can happen? What are the general steps to move towards those outcomes? And be aware of there's going to be some positive and negative. The reality is there are consequences to our actions. So the resolve of every situation is not only just positive situations. Sometimes there are negative consequences, and we got to get through them as well. For students, a lot of times that feel super helpless, helpless or hopeless. It's because they know if this comes to light, or the reason why they don't want anyone to know is because they're going to get in trouble. Recognizing, hey, there are going to be some negative consequences here, and we're going to get through those together. Second is to identify who in the picture. Who are the active participants, and what are their stakes in the outcome? So obviously the student is an active participant. Their parents should be active participants. It could be friends if other people are involved. It could be other youth leaders. It could be other people at the church. So who are the people that are going to be a part of the action plan, and what is their stake in the outcome of you getting healthy, of you being resolved? The next question is, or what are the resources or the roadblocks to reaching the goal? So resources would be things like if there's medical intervention needed, what's the pathway to get that? What's the pathway to find a counselor? What's the pathway to getting them? Maybe the suicide situation is so severe. Hey, we need to go to a place where we got to check you in somewhere right now for your help. That's a resource, and and timing is a potential roadblock to all of those pieces. So the next part of the session. Sorry, I'm talking a lot here, Jared. If there's anything that you want to interject in this, please feel free to jump in. But I'm going to keep talking.
Just imagine I'm not even here. No, this is good stuff.
The next part of the process is who else should be involved in the situation. So we've got the people who are already currently involved. Are there other people we need to bring into the situation for help? Right? Maybe there's a really trusted aunt or uncle that you know. Hey, if I bring them into the situation, they're going to be able to pace with them. They're going to be able to check in on them regularly. They're going to feel like, hey, I'm not alone in this situation. Maybe it's a teacher at school that can check in on them regularly. There's other people that can
multiple
be a part.
Youth leaders. Sometimes you got a tag team situations.
Absolutely. Okay, and then you start to think through, okay, what are the specific steps? In what order do they need to take place? Who's going to be responsible for each step? And who should provide the support necessary for executing the plan? So you don't want to just think, okay, here's the steps. These are the things you need to do, and let's go ahead and execute it. No, these are the things you need to do. Who's going to do it? Who's going to follow up? Whose responsibility is it? Like if it's scheduling an appointment to go see a counselor or a doctor, mom and dad need to be involved in that process. Or if you don't have a car and you can't go see someone, there's different responsibilities involved. The next part of the action plan is understanding the timetable. So like when I've worked with students before who are in crisis and we're like, okay, we got to talk to mom and dad about this, I'll set some specific timelines in place. Now, a lot of times they'll be like, okay, I'll go talk to them. I don't need you to be there. It's probably going to be more awkward. That happens sometimes. So I'll say to them, hey, it's Wednesday now. You need to talk to them before Friday. Right?
Yeah.
And I'm going to check in with you on Friday to find out what's going on, or if you decide, hey, actually, I do want you to be there. So I'll set some very specific timelines.
Or you have till Friday to tell them, and if you don't,
then we're going to tell them together. Yeah. So having specific timelines, I think, helps students to feel like it's more under control, right? Because that's the issue with helplessness and hopelessness is there's no control. Everything is out of control. So by putting some specific timelines in place, all of a sudden you feel like, hey, this is manageable. It may take a month for me to get in to see the doctor, but I know there's a timeline here, or I know that this is happening. And so the more control we can put into the situation, the less helpless it feels. Right? So then the last two parts are what other resources are needed? What else is required? Money, transportation. It might be temporary lodging. Hey, we got to pull you out of this situation. It's not healthy at home here right now.
Yeah.
Who can they stay with? Those sorts of things. Is there food that's needed? Those resources that are needed. And then who will provide ongoing support? We gotta continue with them through this journey. Who's going to continue to pace? You are probably one of them, but there may be other people that are part of the ongoing support system, the ongoing help.
Sometimes we can be good with immediate crisis, but we're not good with ongoing long-term support, and that's often what's needed. So I love that, Mark. That's a great action plan, and we're going to include that for you guys. So if some of you are like, well, that was fast, that was a lot. It was a lot, but we will include that. You can find that if you go to our YouTube page, Better Student Ministry, or our Facebook page. We will have a link there with a downloadable PDF for you, along with some discussion questions we've included. So we want to encourage you guys, if you're pacing right now with students who are going through crisis, we feel you. We know what it's like. We know it's difficult, but we also believe God's called you for this season, for this time.
Absolutely.
And so you can do it. We look forward to being with you guys next time in our next topic. Thanks so much for listening. We'll see you later.
Thanks so much for listening to the Better Student Ministry podcast. If you enjoyed today's content, be sure to check out our 10-minute training videos and discussion guide for you and your team. You can find those on YouTube and Facebook by searching Better Student Ministry. Be sure to give us a 5-star rating, subscribe, and let us know in the comments what topics you would like covered. You can also email us at betterstudentministry@gmail.com.